It all started on a blazing hot Thursday afternoon, the kind where the asphalt seems to ripple under the sun and even the smallest tasks feel like a challenge, when I rolled out of my garage on my midnight black motorcycle, the engine purring like a contented predator. The bike wasn't just a machine to me, it was an extension of myself, the culmination of years of work, sweat, and obsession over chrome, torque, and paint that reflected a deep, polished obsidian sheen in the sunlight. That day, I had no inkling that a routine ride around the neighborhood would spiral into a full-blown confrontation that would expose more than just a disagreement over property. It would reveal the sheer audacity of certain people when they sense a weakness, or at least think they do. I had recently left the Homeowners Association, an organization that prided itself on rules, fees, and a peculiar kind of surveillance over every resident's life, and for reasons I didn't yet understand, my departure had ignited a peculiar vendetta from the president, a woman the locals had long whispered about as HOA Karen. She had the uncanny ability to make minor infractions feel like existential crises, and she wielded her authority like a weapon, wielding her clipboard and pen as if they were swords of justice, the kind that could slice through anyone's sense of dignity. It wasn't just the rules she enforced, it was the way she enforced them, the public shaming, the way she gathered neighbors like spectators for some petty, bureaucratic theater where she always starred as the undisputed heroine. That morning, I had checked the street, the familiar stretches of asphalt, the trimmed hedges, and the sun glinting off parked cars, and I felt a rare sense of peace as I revved the engine, letting the vibrations run through my arms and torso, a physical meditation that reminded me why I had fallen in love with motorcycles in the first place. It was precisely that serenity that made the abrupt intrusion of HOA Karen all the more jarring when she appeared seemingly out of nowhere at the edge of my driveway, her sunglasses perched on the tip of her nose, her stance rigid and confrontational, like she had been waiting for me to make a move she could condemn. "You need to return that motorcycle immediately," she barked, her voice sharp and accusatory, as if she had discovered some mortal sin rather than merely stepping onto a residential driveway. I blinked, taken aback by the audacity, the sheer nonsense of the demand, the way she spoke as if she had the power to confiscate property simply because she believed she had moral authority. My mind raced through 100 possible explanations, trying to reconcile the surreal scene before me. Was this a joke? A misunderstanding? Or had her obsession with control metastasized into a complete disregard for reality? I could see the veins in her neck tighten as she continued, "Your membership doesn't matter anymore. That bike belongs to the HOA, and you will hand it over." I chuckled softly, not out of mockery, but because the sheer absurdity of the situation demanded it. My motorcycle was registered in my name, insured under my policies, financed by me, and stored on my private property. The audacity of her claim was staggering. Yet there was something in her posture, in the way she carried herself as if she had the backing of an unseen army of bylaws and obscure ordinances, that suggested she truly believed she had a right to impose her will. I could see the small gathering of neighbors beginning to take notice, their heads peeking from windows and yards, whispers floating on the hot breeze, curious to witness the unfolding drama. In that instant, I realized this wasn't just about a motorcycle. It was about power, ego, and the human need to assert dominance over others. I took a deep breath, the scent of gasoline and sun-baked asphalt filling my nostrils, grounding me in the moment, and then, with deliberate calm, I removed my helmet, letting the sound of the engine fade into a low hum as I looked her squarely in the eyes. "You really don't want to do this," I said, my voice steady but carrying a weight that surprised even me. Her lips curled into a smirk, a subtle but unmistakable sign that she believed herself untouchable, invincible under the armor of her self-righteousness. It was then that I realized she had no idea who she was dealing with. Because while she saw a man on a motorcycle, a recent ex-member of her precious HOA, what she didn't know was that I had spent years in a line of work that required patience, observation, and a very particular set of skills. Skills that were honed not for confrontation, not for theatrics, but for precise, calculated responses to people who overstepped, people who assumed the rules of society applied only to others, and especially for those who sought to bully their neighbors into submission. I could feel the tension radiating off her in waves, the sort of tension that only comes when someone has misjudged their opponent so completely that the first inkling of realization will crush them. And at that moment, in the sweltering heat, surrounded by the faint scent of cut grass and asphalt, I made a conscious decision: would not escalate with anger. I would not shout, or argue pointlessly, or allow her petty theatrics to dominate the day. Instead, I would let the revelation of truth unfold, slow, deliberate, and undeniable, because when HOA Karen demanded something that was never hers to take, she had unknowingly stepped into a game she couldn't hope to win. I reached into my jacket pocket and slowly, deliberately, produced my badge, letting the sunlight glint off its polished surface. The murmur of the neighbors rose perceptibly, a mixture of surprise and awe, as I tilted it slightly, ensuring she caught the reflection, the emblematic star that confirmed my identity. For a moment, the smirk froze, then faltered, then disappeared entirely, replaced by a flash of recognition, a subtle panic she tried to hide behind a mask of indignation. You're, she stammered, the words catching in her throat as her carefully constructed authority crumbled before my quiet, unyielding presence. I didn't need to say more. The motorcycle, the driveway, the street, it all fell into a surreal silence, punctuated only by the soft hum of the engine and the distant sound of birds. She had assumed power because she misunderstood the boundaries, because she confused petty HOA rules with actual authority. Now, standing there, in the heat and the sunlight, she finally saw the reality: she had overstepped, and I was in a position to enforce boundaries in a way she could neither control nor reverse. That day, what began as a simple ride turned into a revelation, not just for her, but for everyone watching, that audacity has its limits, and sometimes the quiet, measured response carries more power than any shouting or intimidation ever could. The air was thick with tension, almost tangible, as HOA Karen's face flushed a shade of red that seemed impossible under the relentless sun, a stark contrast to my calm, measured presence. I could see her hands trembling slightly, whether from anger, embarrassment, or sheer disbelief, I wasn't certain, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had lost the illusion of control she so desperately clung to. The neighbors, those silent witnesses to her crumbling authority, began to whisper among themselves, their curiosity shifting subtly into admiration, or perhaps relief, that the absurd tyranny of the HOA had finally encountered a wall it couldn't penetrate. I felt a peculiar satisfaction in the quiet acknowledgement that came not from triumphal shouting or self-aggrandizement, but from the simple, undeniable truth of my position. I had spent years building a career where observation, patience, and the quiet assertion of authority were more effective than confrontation, and now, in the suburban heat of a neighborhood that prided itself on lawn regulations and mailbox symmetry, that same principle held sway. Karen's voice, once sharp and commanding, now faltered, a weak echo of its former ferocity. I don't understand, she muttered, almost to herself, a faint quiver betraying the panic she tried to suppress. She had assumed that rules and bureaucracy alone could intimidate, that paper and signatures carried the weight of power, but she had never considered the human element, the person who had trained to enforce laws, who understood rights and procedures, who knew exactly what could, and could not, be done to people who dared challenge boundaries. I kept my gaze steady, letting the badge glint just enough to maintain her attention, a reminder that this wasn't a game or a petty dispute over shared spaces or fees. This was reality, unvarnished and unyielding, and for someone like Karen, whose entire identity was built upon the perception of control, it was a revelation she was clearly struggling to process. Around us, the neighborhood seemed suspended in a strange tableau, cars parked in neat lines, children peeking from behind fences, a dog barking distantly, as if the world itself paused to witness the unraveling of what had always been a quiet, simmering tension beneath the polished lawns and manicured hedges. I spoke again, calm and deliberate, my voice carrying the authority honed over years, the kind that commands attention without raising volume. You need to step back and understand your position before this goes any further. The motorcycle is mine. My property. And my authority doesn't come from HOA bylaws, it comes from the badge I carry, the responsibility I bear, and the consequences you've just set in motion by overstepping. Her eyes widened slightly, and I could see the internal calculations, the rapid-fire mental gymnastics attempting to reconcile what she had assumed with the undeniable reality standing before her. This was more than embarrassment. It was the dawning realization that she had no leverage, no recourse, and no understanding of the person she had chosen to confront. Karen had underestimated me, and that miscalculation, in her world, was catastrophic. The neighbors, sensing the shift, began to murmur with increasing volume, their earlier curiosity giving way to a sort of collective validation of my stance. Some nodded subtly, others exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the relief of seeing tyranny challenged, even in such an ostensibly trivial matter as a motorcycle parked in a driveway. Yet, while the external theater unfolded, my focus remained on controlling the pace, the perception, the impact of every word, gesture, and silence. In my line of work, the timing of revelation is critical. Rush it, and it loses impact; delay it too long, and frustration undermines authority. I let the silence stretch, allowing Karen to squirm in the awareness of her overreach, while I prepared the next step, a measured escalation that would ensure compliance without chaos, an elegant display of authority that reinforced the lesson she desperately needed to learn. I wasn't just protecting my property, I was enforcing boundaries, asserting respect, and demonstrating that the assumptions of power, when untethered from reality, can be dismantled with clarity and precision. After what felt like an eternity compressed into a few tense moments, I finally spoke again, softer this time, yet impossible to ignore. This doesn't have to escalate, Karen. But you need to understand, I enforce rules where necessary, and I protect my property. I don't threaten without reason, and I don't back down when confronted unjustly. You've crossed that line today. The words, calm yet authoritative, seemed to hit her with the force of inevitability. Her hands twitched, her lips parted in an attempt to retort, but no words came. She had reached the point where argument was impossible, where denial was irrelevant, and where the recognition of a superior understanding of law, procedure, and authority left her defenseless. It was an interesting moment to observe someone whose life revolved around imposing order confront the stark reality that control is never absolute. People can hide behind regulations, signatures, and committees, but in the face of direct authority grounded in experience, knowledge, and responsibility, pretension dissolves. Karen's smirk, once so assured, had evaporated entirely, replaced by a mix of incredulity, fear, and begrudging recognition. I let the silence linger, observing the subtle shifts in her posture, the slight step backward as the weight of reality settled upon her. In that moment, I realized that the encounter was not merely a victory over arrogance, but a lesson in human behavior, a demonstration of how entitlement often blinds individuals to the consequences of their actions, and how preparation, patience, and calm authority can turn a potentially volatile situation into a clear, undeniable resolution. Around us, the murmurs of the neighbors grew, not in alarm, but in acknowledgement, an unspoken chorus validating the balance restored on the driveway of a suburban street, where power had been assumed but respect had to be earned. The heat of the day, the roar of the motorcycle engine, the scent of asphalt, and the sun glaring down all combined to create an almost cinematic tableau, where a man, his machine, and the undeniable authority he embodied stood resolute against the crumbling facade of control wielded by HOA Karen. And in that quiet, tense, and unassuming moment, I knew the story of that afternoon would linger in the neighborhood, not just as a tale of confrontation, but as a testament to the fact that authority is real, respect is earned, and assumptions about power can be disastrously wrong. The motorcycle beneath me, solid and unyielding, was more than a vehicle, it was a symbol, a physical representation of what I had fought for, a tangible assertion of independence and ownership that no HOA, no committee, no petty self-appointed ruler could ever take from me without facing consequences they were ill-prepared to manage. I revved the engine once more, softly, almost meditatively, letting it hum a steady, comforting rhythm, a reminder that the world still followed rules beyond the reach of petty egos, that life continued beyond the whims of entitlement, and that, sometimes, the quiet display of power, calm, deliberate, undeniable, is more effective than confrontation, shouting, or dramatics. Karen, now subdued and visibly shaken, finally spoke, her voice barely audible, carrying the faint tremor of someone who realized the full extent of her mistake. I see. Those two words, simple yet laden with reluctant acknowledgement, marked the turning point, the moment where tension shifted from confrontation to realization, where ego met reality, and where the invisible line between entitlement and authority was drawn clearly, irrevocably, on the driveway that had borne witness to the unraveling of control and the establishment of undeniable order. After that day, the neighborhood seemed subtly transformed, though life carried on with its usual routines. Mailboxes were checked, lawns were mowed, and children's laughter echoed down the streets, but beneath the surface, there was a newfound awareness among the residents, a quiet acknowledgement that not all authority could be assumed or enforced without consequence. For me, the relief wasn't merely about reclaiming my motorcycle or asserting my rights. It was the satisfaction of witnessing the unraveling of arrogance, the exposure of pretension, and the quiet establishment of boundaries that had long been ignored or challenged. Over the following weeks, I noticed subtle changes in Karen's behavior, though not in any way that could be called overtly contrite. She still patrolled the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, issuing warnings and citations to neighbors over trivial matters, but there was a discernible hesitation in her posture, a careful calculation in her gaze, as if she were perpetually measuring what could be said, what could be demanded, and what might provoke consequences beyond her control. It was fascinating to observe someone whose identity had been so thoroughly entwined with perceived power struggle against reality, and how an encounter of this nature reshaped their approach, however begrudgingly. I took advantage of the situation not with gloating or confrontation, but with deliberate visibility, making sure that my motorcycle remained in plain view, a symbol not of ego but of independence and measured authority. Every time Karen drove past my house, I could see her eyes flicker ever so slightly toward the driveway, a small acknowledgement of boundaries set and respected, even if she couldn't articulate it aloud. The HOA meetings continued, but my absence became increasingly apparent, and with each session, I observed, sometimes from a distance, sometimes closer, how power vacuums emerge when authority is not backed by genuine legitimacy. Some of the board members whispered about me behind closed doors, speculation about who I was, what I did, and how someone could so casually dismantle the careful web of control they had spun for months, or even years. It was a reminder that authority, real authority, carried weight beyond the physical presence or loud voice. It required knowledge, preparation, and the ability to act decisively, all of which I possessed, and all of which Karen had underestimated. There were evenings when I would sit in the driveway, the motorcycle gleaming in the fading sunlight, reflecting the quiet satisfaction that comes from having set boundaries without unnecessary conflict. I reflected on the absurdity of bureaucracy, the petty obsession with rules over common sense, and the way people so easily mistake positional power for real authority. I thought of the conversations I had had with neighbors in hushed tones, the nods of acknowledgement when I passed, the subtle gratitude in the way people now felt safe to enjoy their properties without fear of arbitrary demands or harassment. It was a quiet victory, one that had not required aggression, litigation, or public spectacle, only patience, observation, and a calm, deliberate assertion of truth. Yet, even with this apparent calm, there was a lingering tension, an unspoken understanding that Karen was never going to fully relinquish her obsession with control. She was driven by ego, by the belief that rules were extensions of herself, and that any deviation, any challenge, was a personal affront. I knew it would take time for her to fully process what had happened, if she ever truly did, but I also knew that the experience had reshaped the neighborhood dynamic in subtle, permanent ways. Over time, I began documenting the interactions, keeping notes on incidents, communications, and minor confrontations, not out of paranoia, but from the practical perspective of someone who understood how small events can escalate, how petty misunderstandings can be weaponized, and how authority, when wielded irresponsibly, can create unnecessary conflicts. I maintained distance, but I also remained vigilant, aware that the combination of my position and the previous confrontation gave me a strategic advantage should any situation escalate again. The motorcycle, gleaming and unyielding, became more than a vehicle. It became a symbol of persistence, vigilance, and personal agency, and it served as a quiet reminder to anyone who might overreach that there are consequences to misjudgment. As days turned into weeks, Karen's presence, while still active, became less imposing. She no longer approached me directly about the motorcycle or attempted to assert control over my property, but she remained visible, a cautionary figure of overreach and entitlement. Neighbors, now emboldened by the clarity of boundaries, became more confident in addressing minor disputes, leaning on the subtle reassurance that they were no longer alone when confronted by petty tyranny. I observed this shift with a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the initial confrontation had ripple effects far beyond the simple recovery of a motorcycle. The lesson had been delivered: authority assumed without legitimacy can be challenged, boundaries can be enforced, and patience combined with measured action can reshape relationships and perceptions. Over time, conversations in the neighborhood shifted, the air of tension giving way to a more balanced sense of community. People still respected rules and boundaries, but they also understood that those rules could not be weaponized without regard for fairness, justice, and the lived reality of those subject to them. Karen, while still present, became more cautious, more deliberate, and less brazen, her ego subtly tempered by the unmistakable demonstration of what happens when assumptions about power collide with undeniable authority. I found a sense of quiet pride in the knowledge that the confrontation had reinforced not only my own boundaries but also those of the community, reminding everyone that respect, vigilance, and integrity carry weight far beyond petty rules and arbitrary authority. And in that balance, life continued, the motorcycle humming softly in the driveway, a steady, comforting reminder of the day when audacity met patience, and boundaries were not only defended but redefined in a way that left lasting impact. Weeks after the initial confrontation, it became clear that HOA Karen was not one to quietly accept defeat, no matter how subtly or decisively it had been delivered. Her visits to the neighborhood became more frequent, her clipboard held like a shield, her eyes darting from one property to another, searching for opportunities to assert authority, to reclaim even a shred of the control she had so publicly lost that day on my driveway. I noticed her whispering to board members, exchanging glances that carried both resentment and calculation, a silent plotting of how to regain leverage without directly challenging me. It was a dangerous game for her because every move she considered was under my observation, every step monitored with the precision of someone trained to assess threat, anticipate outcomes, and respond strategically. I wasn't about to confront her again recklessly, but I understood the patterns, the subtle psychological maneuvers she employed, and I prepared accordingly. My motorcycle remained in the driveway, gleaming like an unspoken statement of ownership, independence, and measured defiance, a constant reminder that some lines, once drawn, could not be crossed without consequences. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows over the neatly trimmed lawns, Karen approached my property again, her steps calculated, her posture a mixture of faux authority and suppressed anxiety. She tried the same tactic she had employed before, assertive language, pointed gestures, and the implication of authority she hoped I would recognize. "You know the rules," she said, her voice pitched higher than intended, revealing the frustration simmering beneath her carefully maintained composure. "You can't just—" I cut her off before she could finish, stepping slightly forward, the badge around my neck catching the fading light, a subtle but undeniable reminder that this was no longer a negotiation based on HOA bylaws, but on real authority, grounded in law, responsibility, and consequence. "Karen," I said, my tone calm but carrying a weight that made her falter mid-sentence, "you've already crossed the line once. Don't mistake persistence for leverage. I suggest you reconsider your approach before it escalates into something you're not prepared to handle." The effect was immediate. She stopped, blinked, and hesitated as the realization of the imbalance between her assumptions and reality settled in once more. Around us, a few neighbors watched discreetly, some hidden behind fences, others observing from their porches, sensing the subtle tension that had become almost habitual in the wake of the first confrontation. I didn't raise my voice, didn't gesticulate wildly, didn't give her the satisfaction of a public display. Instead, I relied on the quiet confidence that comes from experience, the ability to assert control without performing it, to make the stakes clear without shouting, to allow consequences to speak louder than threats. Karen's eyes narrowed, a mix of resentment and calculation, as she searched for a response that could restore even the illusion of her authority. But I had anticipated every likely reaction, every gambit she might attempt. I had arranged for neighbors to witness interactions from a distance, ensuring that any escalation on her part would be carefully documented, making any overreach both visible and undeniable. I wasn't playing games, but I understood the power of perception. She believed herself in a position to manipulate outcomes, but the reality was that every move she made had consequences she was ill-prepared to manage. She tried once more, softer this time, her voice edged with forced politeness. "I just want to make sure the neighborhood remains in compliance." "You understand." Her words trailed off, and I let them, giving her space to recognize the futility of her position. I didn't need to finish the argument for her, the truth was self-evident. The motorcycle sat between us, a silent testament to the balance of authority, the line between assumption and reality, and the careful calibration of power. She shifted, glancing nervously at the small group of neighbors observing from porches and behind hedges, then muttered something about leaving the matter alone, though the frustration was unmistakable in the tight set of her jaw and the flicker of irritation in her eyes. I watched her retreat down the driveway, clipboard clutched to her chest, and I knew this wasn't the end of her attempts, merely a temporary retreat. But that was fine. I had prepared for the long game, for patience, for measured responses that ensured my property, my rights, and my authority remained intact without unnecessary escalation. That evening, as I sat on the motorcycle, helmet in hand, I reflected on the unfolding dynamics, how entitlement can drive people to absurd lengths, how arrogance often blinds them to reality, and how a calm, deliberate display of competence can dismantle even the most carefully constructed illusions of control. I understood Karen better now, her obsession with rules, her need to be seen as the ultimate authority, her inability to process failure, all of it was predictable, manageable, and ultimately irrelevant to the truth of my position. The neighborhood, I realized, was slowly learning this lesson too. People began addressing minor disputes without fear, understanding that the balance between authority and accountability was not determined by titles alone, but by action, knowledge, and consequence. And while Karen continued her small attempts to assert relevance, her power had diminished, reduced to whispers and glances rather than bold confrontations. I could almost hear the internal calculations she was making, the self-justifications, the strategies to regain stature. I let her imagine she had options, knowing that any misstep would only reinforce the lessons she had already learned. The motorcycle, solid beneath me, reflected the low sunlight, a constant, calming hum of controlled energy that reminded me why I had invested so much in both the machine and in maintaining clarity of boundaries. That evening, as the sky turned shades of orange and purple, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from defeating someone, not from humiliation, but from the deliberate, careful assertion of truth and authority, the knowledge that patience and preparation could manage arrogance more effectively than confrontation or theatrics. The driveway, once a scene of sudden confrontation, had become a stage for subtle, ongoing lessons in human behavior, boundaries, and respect, and I understood that my actions had ripple effects that extended beyond the immediate dispute. Karen had learned, the neighborhood had learned, and I, as always, had maintained control, not through intimidation, but through competence, presence, and the unwavering assertion of what was rightfully mine. As the weeks turned into months, the dynamics of the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, one subtly but permanently altered by the events surrounding my motorcycle and the confrontation with HOA Karen. Her presence remained, as it always had, a fixture in the manicured streets and tidy lawns, but the sharpness of her authority had dulled, replaced by cautious observation and carefully measured interactions that reflected the lessons she had been forced to learn. The neighbors, once tentative in confronting petty disputes or arbitrary rules, began to exercise their own judgment with quiet confidence, emboldened by the demonstration that power assumed is not power guaranteed, and that lines drawn without authority can be firmly and respectfully enforced. I continued to maintain my motorcycle as both a practical tool and a symbol, a physical reminder of boundaries, personal agency, and the deliberate, patient assertion of rights that required no unnecessary spectacle to be effective. HOA Karen, for all her persistence, had learned that some challenges are not overcome with ego or rules alone, they require understanding, calculation, and, above all, respect for reality and consequence. She approached interactions with the board more cautiously, her posture subdued, her words chosen with care, no longer attempting to impose on me directly, though subtle attempts to influence others still surfaced, now easily observed and, if necessary, countered. I watched these developments with a measured sense of satisfaction, understanding that the true victory had not been mine alone, it had been shared with the community, whose confidence, safety, and awareness of boundaries had been quietly reinforced. My role, while active, had not required domination or aggression, but patience, observation, and strategic assertion, principles that extended beyond a single confrontation or a single individual. In the evenings, I would often sit on the motorcycle in the driveway, helmet resting on my knee, engine idling softly, reflecting on the events that had unfolded and the subtle but profound lessons embedded within them. Power is not granted by titles, committees, or assumed authority, it is earned through understanding, action, and the responsible use of knowledge and skill. Entitlement can drive people to absurd lengths, as Karen had demonstrated, but experience and preparation create an invisible shield, one that protects not only property but dignity, autonomy, and respect. Conversations among neighbors shifted as well, the air of tentative fear gave way to a cautious optimism, a sense that personal rights were recognized and enforceable, and that the assertion of unjust authority would not go unanswered. Karen's eventual retreat from direct confrontations with me marked the culmination of the process, though I knew she would continue to navigate the social landscape of the HOA with her characteristic vigilance, subtlety, and ego. I welcomed this, understanding that respect earned through competence and consistency is far more durable than fear imposed through intimidation. Life resumed its familiar cadence, but beneath the surface, subtle lessons had been internalized, creating a quieter, more balanced community, one where boundaries were recognized, authority was respected, and entitlement could no longer dictate the rules of engagement. The motorcycle remained, shining under the sun, a testament to patience, preparedness, and the quiet assertion of rights without unnecessary conflict, a symbol not of ego, but of measured, undeniable authority. As I revved the engine and rode through the neighborhood, the familiar hum of the machine under me, I felt a sense of completion and calm. HOA Karen had been taught, the neighborhood had learned, and I had maintained control, not through confrontation, but through presence, strategy, and unwavering adherence to principle. The experience had reinforced what I already knew, that patience, preparation, and quiet confidence are far more powerful than noise, bluster, or assumed authority. And in that quiet, powerful understanding, life went on, boundaries respected, lessons remembered, and the hum of my motorcycle a steady, reassuring reminder that authority, when exercised responsibly, commands respect effortlessly. The confrontation had ended not with drama, but with clarity, not with resentment, but with acknowledgement, and the neighborhood, myself included, emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware of the true nature of power, respect, and consequence. Even HOA Karen, though diminished in perceived influence, remained part of the social landscape, her presence a constant reminder of the balance between assumption and reality, between ego and authority, and between entitlement and consequence. That balance, delicately maintained, would guide future interactions, creating a more equitable and respectful environment for all, and cementing the understanding that audacity has limits, patience has power, and boundaries, once clearly set, are not to be tested lightly. With a final glance at the driveway, the motorcycle gleaming in the afternoon light, I knew the story had reached its natural conclusion, a tale of confrontation, awareness, and the enduring strength of measured authority in the face of assumed power. And in that realization, there was peace, satisfaction, and the quiet confidence that comes from having faced audacity with calm, competence, and undeniable truth.